Welcome, everyone, and happy Fallout 25 years of Fallout. And we have some amazing guests joining Oxhorn and I tonight. Two men that need no introduction in this community. Top left, we have Leonard Boyarsky, who is lead artist and art director on Fallout. Hello, Leonard.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Just above me, very Brady Bunch style, we have Tim Cain, producer and lead programmer for Fallout. How are you, Tim?
I'm good, and it's good to be here.
Awesome to have you. To my left is Oxhorn, who's going to be co-hosting with me today. How are you, Ox?
Feeling great. Can't wait to dive in. I'm excited. 25 years. Long time coming.
Firstly, it is surreal and incredible honor to have the two of you with us today, celebrating 25 years of Fallout. And we were talking about this just before we got started. Did you ever imagine that this game would just keep going on and on for decades and generations?
I thought it was going to be more impactful than it was at the beginning. So I guess eventually I was proven right. But I don't think we thought in terms of longevity. We thought, hey, it's going to happen now if people really like it, if it makes any kind of mark on the landscape, it's going to happen now, because what was there, like 10 years of video games before that, if even that at that point?
I like to say there were 16 years of video games. But I think the only clue I had that we're onto something is when our QA people started coming in nights and weekends to play the game before we shipped. Even though they could have come in and been paid overtime to work on other games, they were coming in their own time and not clocking in just to play the game. And I thought I'd never heard anything like that. I was shocked.
That's some real dedication there.
A lot of them wanted to finish. They wanted to finish before they got the new one on Monday that would wipe out save games.
Oh.
And so they were just coming in nights and weekend time to finish off a playthrough. And they were having fun too. And they were telling us what they were doing, but it was dedication and passion and a little bit of addiction.
So, Leonard, you said that you had greater expectations right off the bat. How long would you say it took before it sort of the ball started rolling and it amped up to have the sensational release and acceptance that you predicted at the time?
Well, I feel like right away a lot of people got what we were doing, but it seemed very niche. It seemed like it's kind of like the Velvet Underground. They say, the only people who bought Velvet Underground records all became musicians or press people. And I feel like it was the same thing with us. Like a lot of the people who are really into us became either press people or game developers themselves. So I feel like it had an oversized impact in that way. And then, obviously, I think when Bethesda brought it to a wider audience is when it really exploded and people really started to take notice of it again. All through that time, whenever I talk to people always, brought up Fallout and loved Fallout. But for the wider, more general marketplace, it was definitely Bethesda.
Do you think that it had to do with the genre, that people were just expecting more like a fantasy themed genre, like many of the games that were coming out at that time? Or do you think it was just down to the humor or the gameplay or the setting?
You mean in terms of why they liked it or why it didn't take off sooner?
Why it didn't take off quite as soon?
Maybe. I mean, I think there is a ready-made built-in audience for fantasy games, especially RPGs, because most RPGs up to that point had been that, or at least more of the bigger ones had been that. For me, it was always kind of a labor of love and just almost blind belief, arrogant or naivete, whatever you want to call it, that we were doing something unique. And, one of the things that I really loved about it was I really wanted it to feel like, from the manual to the box to everything about it, that it felt like something you found in the world itself. The interface, the maps, all that stuff were like found objects in the world. And that, to me, you know, it made me so sad when manuals weren't a thing anymore, because I loved the manual that Chris Taylor put together, you know, that looked like a vault dweller survival guide kind of thing. And, it, you know, the conceit was that was something you got in the vault. And to me, that was almost as cool as the game itself, just having that you know, the spiral bound manual that you could lay flat.
Yeah, and that's the one thing that I weep about with the world going so digital now. I still have all of my big chunky manuals from games that I loved growing up, that you get it and you flip through Christmas Day to actually appreciate the game before you even dive in. Even the Fallout one, you get some recipes in the back there, Tim.
Well, back then, I mean, Fallout filled an entire CD-ROM. So if you wanted to install it, it was going to be probably about 50 minutes to an hour. So you had some time to peruse the manual. So we wanted to kind of get you into the world right away. And now, you know, people can, you know, stream a game and instantly play it. So there's no, the game itself has to prepare you for what the world is.
Yeah, I can see how that really changes around narrative structure, particularly. There's one piece of to do before we dive in here that I did want to mention. The reason that we're here today, of course, is St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. For anybody who doesn't know, who's heard of Fallout for Hope for the first time, we're a group of over 400 gamers worldwide in 86 countries that gets together a few times a year to raise money for charitable causes. We are just closing in on $400,000 raised by the Fallout community since we started in 2020, hoping to cross the $500 million mark before the end of the year. With St. Jude particularly, we've raised over $276,000. That number in and of itself becomes even more remarkable when you break down what that number has actually done, that this community has done. 4 major life-saving procedures, 30 days of chemo, 365 no more chemo parties for kids who completed their treatment, 30 bone marrow treatments, grocery store gift cards for a family for 2 years, 365 plasma transfusions, 12 months of child life specialist services, helping run the St. Jude Blood Donor Center for a week, 100 red wagons, 65 sets of art supplies, and 41 new toys for hospital play areas. The community did that. This is what we do. And with the work that St. Jude has done, particularly to help fight and eliminate childhood diseases around the world, is really breathtaking. So if you can, much appreciated. Exclamation point charity will bring up the link to support us on Tiltify today. And now back to the stuff that you want to hear about.
I had a question, Leonard. You mentioned found objects as being an inspiration for much of the design, including some of the interface design of Fallout 1. And one of the things that I was always really curious about was just the physical manifestation of the Pip-Boy, because I kind of got the impression playing Fallout 1 that it was almost like it wasn't attached to your body. It was something you pulled out of a wallet, or maybe it was a tablet-like device. And so I tried to recreate it, and I went on to Etsy and I found a creator who made a little box-like thing to emulate the Pip-Boy from Fallout 1. And it's got, I don't think you can see it, but it's got little lights you can turn on, and it's hard to see, but it's got really just cool. All the little things of the interface. But I was wondering, like, how did you conceive of it? Did you think of it as a wrist-mounted device, or more like tablet, or what was in your mind?
It was more actually like just something you held in your hand like that. I imagined it was like hooked onto the belt or something. You know, Tony Postma was a concept artist who was working with us. And, you know, I wasn't really good in industrial design. And I found out that he went to Art Center like I did, and he was an industrial design major. I'm like, oh, I'm going to have him design this stuff for us. So, you know, I went to him and said, you know, we want heavy industrial. We want it to look like it's part of the world. And he came up with the basic aesthetics of the main interface. And I think what happened was, because that screen, like the main screen you had there, you can't see it on there. It doesn't have it. There was a little hood on it, a tiny little, like, decorative little piece on it. Right in the center or something. Oh, there you go. Yeah, there it is, right in the center. that's on every screen because all we did was like scale that screen. I made it once and we scaled it for everything else. But that was on our main interface. And then I know Jason did a lot of that work. Jason Anderson, our lead, our technical art director. He was just amazing with that stuff. And he put a lot of those, a lot of the aesthetics together with the vacuum tubes and all that. So I think that was part him and part Tony, but that kind of thing just really is an example of the kind of, tactile feel we wanted to have everything have in the game. Speaking of the manuals and things we miss, I don't want an interface that clutters up my world, that clutters up my screen space, but at the same time, I feel like we've lost something with all the clunkiness and all the cool artistic clunkiness, not the functional clunkiness of those kind of interfaces.
Yeah, even with games, Diablo, which we were going to talk about anyways, because that came out not too far after you guys started. I'm thinking too the interface of that kind of ran along the bottom, and everything's kind of really stylized and branded, so you feel like it's designed to be part of the world space. Yeah, I think we've definitely lost that.
Well, part of it was just to hide half of your screen or part of your screen so you didn't have to render it.
That big interface helped us a lot.
So take us back to the very beginning. Tim, talk about your growing up, where you went to school, what some of the hobbies that kind of led you into game development as a career.
Well, I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, right outside of DC. I have 4 older brothers and sisters, but the oldest 3 were a good 8 years, 8, 10, and 12 years older than me. So I had a brother who was 2 years older than me, and we kind of were twins, and we did everything together. We played board games. We'd make board games. My mom got us an Atari VCS when we were little, that cartridge-based console, which just enthralled us. And shortly thereafter, my school got an Atari 400 computer. Everybody else got Apples. We got Ataris. So I was kind of self-taught in BASIC and assembly when I was about 14. At the same time, my mother worked in the Judge Advocate General's office of the Navy. I always thought she was a secretary, but they had something word for it. She had top secret clearance. So she worked with admirals, and they would get something that would have to be typed up, and she was the only one who had clearance who could read it. One day she came home, I was 14 years old, and she said, "The boys at work are playing a game." The boys were admirals in the Navy, and the game was AD&D, the first version. She goes, "I think we should go over one of their houses and play this weekend." And I was like, okay. So I did play D&D with my mother the first time. I was hooked and started playing D&D all the time. And when I wasn't playing D&D, I was programming on these Ataris at school. Eventually got one myself. And then, I know I've mentioned this before, I got my first job offer at a game company when I was 15. They were making set-top console or set-top cable box video games, and they needed an art tool for it, and IBM PCs couldn't, and Apples couldn't do the art resolution, but an Atari could. But I wasn't old enough to get hired because I was only 15. But I was almost 16, so they said call back in 2 months, and if we haven't hired anyone, we'll hire you. So on my 16th birthday, I got my driver's license and then drove out to a game company in Reston, Virginia. And that was the first job I ever had in my life. And I've never not worked in the game industry since then. So I've been in this industry for a long time, since 1981.
Oh.
I'm old. But
yeah, that's when I was born.
Okay, I gotta go.
Sorry.
But yeah, I mean, I was 16 years old, and I would be at school with my friends, and then I'd get in my 68 Mustang, which was a hand-me-down from my brother, and drive out to a game company and be there from like 2 p.m. to about 7 p.m. Just coding. I taught myself C because basic you couldn't do things in basic, so I learned C, and then I taught one of the guys there C because they didn't know C, and I'm like, well, this is what I put together because my school taught Pascal, and I kind of figured out how C worked because it was kind of like Pascal. It was just it's so random what happened in my life, and then I ended up playing tons of tabletop RPGs and knowing all these languages and how to work computers, going out to California to go to grad school and not liking it, and then I ended up at Interplay. So I think by the first game I did there, Leonard, you did art for it. Didn't you do the paintings on Rags to Riches?
I was trying to get a job doing freelance stuff, but they were oil paintings, and when you tried to scan them in, they became very, very pixelated, and I know that you had problems getting them into the game. And so they went with a company that actually had experience making art for video games, unlike me at the time.
What about you, Leonard? What were some of the hobbies that you had growing up? You went to school for it, right?
I went to school for art.
Oh, for art.
I had no inkling that I would ever be involved in things like video games. I got D&D when it first came out as well. I'm not sure if it was the first or second edition. It was very early on, though. It was like in 78, 79 maybe. But I didn't know anybody who played, and my mom definitely didn't know anybody who played. And so I tried, if you don't know how to play and you try to just read the manual and grab a bunch of people and play, you spend a lot of time making your characters and you die very quickly. And we just couldn't figure it out, and no one besides me really cared to try. So I had this thing called D&D that I didn't know anybody else played it, and I would just read the books and imagine what playing an RPG was like. And I guess this goes to show, or it says something about how my career ended up. I wasn't thinking about fighting things in dungeons. I was thinking more about like the stories and the worlds, and almost like what a holodeck would be, way back then. It's just like, oh, if you could play, and it wasn't, I didn't understand even like how you did it really. I'd never even seen anybody play it. So I didn't know how much role playing was going on or any of that stuff. So it was really just this rich fantasy thing for me that I really wanted to experience, but I didn't even get a chance to really play a pen and paper role playing game until I played GURPS with Tim at Interplay. So it was quite a bit of time between those two events. I went to school to be an artist. I went to Cal State Fullerton, and I went to the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. I 100% was just going to be, I wanted to be like Norman Rockwell, a weirder version of Norman Rockwell. I just worshipped him when I was a kid. His skill and his paintings were just blew me away. And I 100% was pursuing that. And then my last year at Art Center, they got computers, and I wanted to sign up for a course, but they got it halfway through my second to last semester. And I wanted to sign up to take a course in computers because I'm like, that seems like there's going to be, that's a definite part of the future here. And they're like, oh, you have to take an intro to computer classes before you can take any art classes. And I'm like, that's my last semester. I'm not going to do that. And so I graduated. I went off and tried to be a freelance artist for a while. Got some, did a couple of album covers for independent record companies. I did a paperback book cover. Nothing really like clicked. I mean, I thought the stuff I was doing was good, but I wasn't really picking up any speed, or I was already living with a girl who'd end up becoming my wife. She had a very young daughter who I helped her start raising, who was only a year old at the time. So I really needed to find a job. And what had happened was Disney was starting up a video game company that was called Buena Vista, which has nothing to do with any other Buena Vista permutation after that. But they came to my school and recruited a whole bunch of people who are my friends, but in the semester ahead of me, because I had taken a year ahead of me, because I had taken a year off in the middle of it, because I was I was really burned out. I'd already done, a full college, a full run at college at Cal State Fullerton, and then went to Pasadena. And so they were all ahead of me. So a bunch of them got hired. And then, so, 6 months, 8 months after I graduated, I really need to figure out something to do. So I called one of them and I said, hey, you guys are all working at this Buena Vista thing. Is there any way I could get in there? Is there any jobs they have there? And so I went up there, and they were in LA. I'm in Orange County, which is like an hour and a half away without traffic where they were. And I drove all the way up there, and all I had was a whole bunch of oil paintings and acrylic paintings, this giant portfolio. And I went in there and showed the art director my paintings. And he's like, oh, this is great. When can you start? And I'm like, well, full disclosure, I've used an Apple because my parents had a Mac, and I took a basic programming class in high school that I almost failed, but we cheated and stole somebody's password. Don't tell anybody, to finish our project. It wasn't really hacking or anything. I think one of my friends looked over the guy's shoulder while he was typing his password in. So that's how sophisticated we were. Anyway, so I showed this guy my stuff.
Leonard's a hacker.
Yeah, really. I showed him this stuff, and I said, I can't use a computer, and he's like, I can teach you how to use a computer in 2 days. I don't have time to teach you how to be an artist. And because of that, I now had a career, because there was no way I could have gotten my foot in the door if I needed to know anything about computers at that time. So I got hired, and this is how crazy it was back then. It was a kids game, and I was the only artist on it. So immediately I was the lead artist. I'm like, that's great. What am I supposed to do now? Can someone teach me what I'm supposed to do? And within a month, it became obvious that there was no design for this game. So I'm in a room with these other people who are making this game. We're trying to design this game. I didn't play very many video games. I played like Wizardry. I played Zork. When I'd go to the arcade to play video games, I'd die really quickly and then watch my friends and be all amazed at the art, like when they're playing Marvel fighting games or whatever. And ironically, the company that I was hired through, it was this weird outsourcing situation or a developer situation, and it was Quicksilver. They never, ever worked for anybody at Interplay, except for this one time they were working with Buena Vista. So that project got canceled. And then I got another project as a freelance, just helping cut things out of backgrounds. In this other project called Unnatural Selection, I actually got to do some pixel art. I did some interface stuff and a lot of little touch-up stuff because it was really badly blue screen. So I was cutting things out of backgrounds. And then through Quicksilver, I actually ended up doing a couple of things for Interplay. And then when that Unnatural Selection job was over, I went to Interplay to try to get a job. And they'd been working on Stonekeep for a little while. And coincidentally, they had these horribly blue screened actors, and they needed somebody to cut them out of backgrounds. So here I go in there with 2 art degrees, cutting characters out of backgrounds. And it was not fun. I mean, it was fun to be doing that. It was fun to be working. It was fun. Like, technically, I'm an artist. But at first I was cranking through stuff, and I was doing it so fast and such a good job on it that they actually were letting me do other art. So that was kind of cool. But then they realized they had given me the wrong instructions. They're like, oh, we didn't figure out quite how this works. So you're going to have to do all those over again. Oh. And I got really pissed off. And I have a whole 3 or 4 paintings I did at that point in time because I was like, I'm done. I'm out of here. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to get a real art job. And then right around that time, they got SGI machines, which were these $35,000 computers. And they had not Maya, they had Power Animator on them, which is the precursor to Maya. You had to have this SGI machine, Silicon Graphics machine, to run these things. And they were in an office right next to where I was working. There was 3 of them, I think, or 4 of them. And the reason they were sitting in this office with no one working on them is because Interplay did all this research about what's the best software, what's the best, computers, how do we get the best to do this stuff? And so they got that stuff, but they forgot to figure out how are they going to hire people to work on those machines, because everybody who knew how to work those were working at ILM or places like that, making a lot more than they were paying us at the time. So I didn't really get anything going from those paintings, and I just started coming in, staying after work late. and I taught myself how to do 3D art from scratch with a manual, no internet. Nobody had asked how to do this stuff. And I made this animated tentacle creature for Stonekeep. And then that's where I made the jump over to 3D art. And then the reason I ended up on the art director on Fallout was because the guy who probably would have been the art director on Fallout quit. He left the company, he finished Stonekeep and then left. So it's just like with what Tim was saying, it's these weird random sequence of events that I, first of all, even ended up in the computer game industry. And then the fact that I ended up being an art director on this project with Tim was complete happenstance.
Well, even to tack onto that,
You're muted,
that's
Tim.
how I kind of met Leonard, was because the operating system for those SGIs was Unix. And none of the programmers at Interplay knew Unix, but I had gone to engineering school at University of Virginia, and everything was Unix based. So in addition to like DOS, and I knew Unix. So whenever they had a problem, it was you and Kevin Beardsley and one other artist.
Tony Valron.
Tony Valron. You guys would come into my office, and they'd always have the same like, and I'd go there, and and Unix is really obtuse. I don't know if you've ever done anything with it, but it's all command driven, and it's just the commands seem random, and I'd go in there and I'd try to get it fixed for them. And so that's how I kind of met all these 3D artists who were cutting edge at Interplay.
That was a great time to be a 3D artist, I got to tell you, because there was no 3D artists anywhere. And if you knew 3D art, you could write your own ticket. It was a great time to be in the industry as a 3D artist. That's all I got to say.
So take us, so the stars are kind of coming together. So take us, Tim, to 1994, because, and I know you've told this story 1,000 times, but it still blows my mind. This game, everything that this came to be, started with you just doing this on your free time.
Yeah, what had happened was, when I was at grad school at UCI, University of California, Irvine, before any of that, and I had gotten a contract job at Interplay, and I made Bard's Tale construction set. So then they hired me to do a business game. I don't know anything about business. Troika proves that. But I was, yeah, that's a whole pile
That's
of
a
things.
whole story. Yeah.
And there was a guy doing Lord of the Rings, and I've read Lord of the Rings back to front several times, and we tried to switch projects. We both had the same experience. We were just going to switch. They wouldn't let us switch. So I did the business game called Rags to Riches. Kind of knew Leonard through it because he had done the art. Then when that shipped, they didn't have something to put me on, so they were having me make installers. Because back then, when you made a game, each individual game needed its own installer made, because some used 3.5-inch floppies, some used 5.25-inch floppies, some came in CD-ROMs. They had different numbers of floppies. They had different things. So what I did is I made a few of those, and I got bored because it was stupid. So I made an installer. It's kind of meta. I made a program that you typed in things like, it would be on 4 disks. Here's where the executable was. Here's how the data was arranged, and that program would then spit out an installation program. Once I had that, I didn't have anything to do because people could come to me and I'd go, click, here are your disks. So I started making engines. I made a 3D engine, which was absolutely horrible. It was incredibly slow. It couldn't texture anything, so everything was gray polys. We eventually hired a 3D programmer that I met on an online multiplayer MUD, which right there dates me. We met on a MUD. He was in Texas. He flew out. He got a job as a 3D programmer, and he started making the Star Trek Starfleet Academy game. And I never made a 3D engine again. Then I made a voxel engine. That was horrible. Then I made a isometric engine. While I was doing all this, I was getting together at night and playing GURPS in one of the conference rooms. And Leonard was in one of the groups that I did that with. And it was a simple little dungeon. It was maybe 6 rooms. And the next night I ran a different group through and Leonard came and watched. And then the next night I ran a third group through and Leonard watched that as well. And I remember him saying something like, it's a simple dungeon. why is it playing so differently every time these groups go through? And I'm like, well, GURPS lets you build wildly different characters. They're doing different things. Some are attacking, some are sneaking through. Some stop to talk to someone, and it turned out he had been kidnapped, and they rescued him, and he helped do things later. And it was 6 rooms, and it played out wildly different all 3 times, all 3 nights. And we started talking about, isn't that amazing that if you just give people a little bit of leeway in a game, the story which they produce, because I wasn't making a story. I wasn't telling them go kill this person or go attack that monster or steal this or burn that or backstab that guy. They were doing that all on their own. And I would often absolve myself of anything. One group died and they're like, you were too mean. I'm like, the last 2 nights, everybody was fine. That was entirely on you guys. And I think Leonard and I were talking about making a game, and we were like, why can't we make a game like that? Because RPGs tended to be, in my mind, computer RPGs, way too rigid in the storyline. That you had to play, you were given a character who was already sort of pre-made, and he kind of went to a story that was already pre-made, and you were forced to do it. In fact, at the time, I loved Ultima. Ultima 3 was my favorite RPG, but I didn't like the fact that you were just kind of assumed to be this certain character, and you were assumed to be good. Years later, I had a discussion with Richard Garriott about that, about why did you make everyone be good? He goes, well, I thought that was, you should be a paragon of virtue. And I'm like, I let people be horrible child killers if they wanted to be. But that was on them. The game didn't force them or even direct them. If you wanted to be that way, and I would hate when people said, the game lets me kill people. No, you're killing people. The game isn't directing you to do anything. And when they would say it about Fallout, a game that was completely pacifist, it just would make me so angry because I'm like, the game did not make you kill people. Anyway, we started talking about all that, and GURPS was so much fun, and so many people played that when Interplay announced they were trying to get a game license, this is before they had D&D, I suggested GURPS. Another producer suggested Earth Dawn. You're like, what? And then there was another game suggested, and they ended up getting GURPS. And because I was the advocate, they're like, okay, do something with this license we just bought. And I'm like, well, it just so happens I've got this engine that I made when I was supposed to be making installers. And everyone was like, great, do that. And I'm like, who do I get? And they're like, well, we're not going to sign anybody to you. Show us what you can do first. And I'm like, I'm not an artist. I'm not a writer. And that's when that famous thing happened where I said, okay, I'm going to order some pizzas at 6 p.m. and I'm going to sit in the main conference room. And it had windowed. It was the windowed conference room on the first floor. And I watched people leaving to go home. I thought 12, 15 people would show up. And I think 6 did.
Well, you did also say in the email that whoever wanted to eat pizza and design a game, it wasn't a secret what you were there with the pizzas for. Yeah. So I'm like, wow, there's going to be standing room only in there. I better get there early. There's not going to, And then I showed up and there's like, what, five or 4 other people and me and Tim.
I think we had as many pizzas as we had people.
I hope it was good pizza.
Very optimistic.
Was it a known pizza chain?
I don't even remember.
Fallout was made by Domino's Pizza.
Sponsored by Domino's. But I had the engine and I showed it to everybody. I'm like, look what I can do. And it was stupid. It was just like people walking around. But I didn't know what we could do with that. And luckily, the group that came up, Leonard was there. Was Jason there, or was Jason hired afterwards? No,
Jason was there. That's why it's kind of weird, the whole thing, because I feel like, at least on some level, it was obvious that I was going to eventually be on your game. I don't know if that was just us thinking that was going to happen, or it was just like we were looking at what was going on and we're like, well, that's obviously the place I'm going to end up. But Jason was there because I think me and him went together because I was already talking to him about different stuff because he had just started recently, I think, if I'm remembering correctly.
He had been assigned to me. He was hired.
Yeah.
And they said, okay, you can have a 3D artist. Do something with him.
Which again is just the coincidences and luck is just crazy because he worked at Toys R Us as a manager. He had no art experience whatsoever. One of his good friends had a pirated copy of 3D Studio Max, and he got a job at Interplay. And Jason's like, I could do that. And so he like taught himself how to use it because he's really, really smart, technically minded guy. And he got hired. And he was the first artist to sign, like Tim said. I had worked on Stone Keep, but basically I made sprites, and someone would say, this is, you're going to make this many rotations, you're going to render off this many frames, here's the format we need, here's how you're going to palette them, because it was like, that wasn't even 640, 480. We were so fired up that Fallout was going to be 640, 480. Or was it? It was. No, I know it was Fallout was, Stone Keep was 320, right?
320, 240. We used extended mode.
But yeah, so Jason he's a really great artist, but he's natural, obviously, because he had no training. And he could speak programmer and he could speak art, because me and Tim got along really well, but I wouldn't have had any idea what Tim was talking about when it came to technical stuff without Jason to like figure out how to do that stuff. And like, since it was GURPS, it was based on hexes, and you can't tile hexes. And so Jason figured out how to extrapolate what we needed and still tile all the artwork based on squares. And I was just like, my eyes would be glazing over as he's telling me what we were doing. I'm like, okay, cool. So here's a picture of a gas station. Can you make that work in our system? Because I rendered that white Doc Morbid's gas station was one of the first things I rendered for the game after we had decided it was going to be like late 1940s, early 50s thing. But
speaking of that, I actually had a question about the setting, and because a lot of what we see is, especially in the architecture of the world, it's kind of got this Art Deco brutalist architecture sort of thing. But then when we encounter many of the people that are living in the post-apocalypse and using weapons like the Desert Eagle, it kind of gives an 80s Mad Max vibe. I mean, there of course was that reference to Mad Max with dog meat in Junktown. But was there like a hard decision to be like, okay, this is the kind of feel we're going for, or was it more loosely based where it was a mishmash of certain things to develop its own sort of atmosphere?
It was a mishmash because we didn't decide that until a while into it. We were making a basic Road Warrior homage or ripoff, however you want to look at it. And
far from the best.
Yeah. But it's post-apocalyptic. Me and Jason were huge Road Warrior fans, and we really wanted to make something in the spirit of that. And then one day, for some bizarre reason, I just decided, this should be like this post-apocalyptic 1950s future thing. And I came back to work the next day and I told Tim, and he looked at me like I was crazy. I talked to Rob Nessler, who was the art director, the 3D artist at the time. He looked at me like I was crazy, but they had enough faith in me to let me just do it. So Jason totally got it immediately. He thought that was really cool. We had already created a bunch of characters, a bunch of the models for characters. We'd done a decent amount of artwork at that point, but there was still obviously a whole bunch of artwork to be done, or we wouldn't have been able to make that change. So still fairly early on, but that's why you have that. Like, it's funny because we were talking before we started this podcast that, or the stream that, you can find that crashed flying saucer in the desert with the velvet painting of Elvis. Well, technically that doesn't fit in the rules of the Fallout world because, excuse me, it's kind of supposed to be this idealized 1950s. So it was not like the actual 1950s. It was like the powers that be in advertising what they said the 1950s was going to be. So there would be no Elvis because that's definitely not what they thought the 50s was going to be. But it was a real mishmash. Obviously, there's Doctor Who. TARDIS shows up at one point. The random encounters were almost. I really loved in New Vegas where they did the weird Wasteland perk.
I love that.
That was a perfect encapsulation of how it was kind of like when you're out in the wasteland, anything can happen. It was like that wasn't serious. That was like Warner Brothers cartoons. It's like the craziest stuff we could think of. There was no like, oh, we can't do that. It was like whatever we thought of, we would put out there. And then when you're in towns, we were all serious about what was supposed to happen, what was going on. And here's the kind of vibe. But it was a real conglomeration of those two things because because we didn't start with that idea originally. And then the third thing that came on much later was I had already built the power armor very early, and it was really, really bad 90s sci-fi kind of looking thing. And I had to make the helmet for the movie, for the intro movie, a close-up of it. And it just really wasn't going to hold up. So I just went back to square one and just started making this thing in 3D. And I just felt like it had to have this really analog, kind of like clunky industrial feel, which technically isn't straight up 50s either. If I'd been thinking along those lines, I probably would have made it a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more atom punk, as they call it these days. But so I think that's an aspect of it too, that really kind of clunky technology, which of course I still am into to this day. We kind of brought that into the Outer Worlds as well. But it was so like there was all these different disparate things being pushed together. And I think as we, when we started working on Fallout 2, I think we were starting to refine that already. But
the clunky tech came from City of Lost Children too.
That was a huge thing.
Loved that movie. Ron Perlman, an interesting intersection in that movie. Ron Perlman, star of, and if you haven't seen this, it is just, it's subtitled, but it's worth a watch because you see a lot of.
It's got some of the best music that I've ever heard in a movie. It's just amazing music.
City of Lost Children.
No idea. Wow.
And also you get a little flavor of kind of a robo brain there.
Yeah. And Ron Perlman speaks French in it.
Yes.
So, bing, bing, bing.
We watched that a couple different times. That was an influence. The Roadware obviously influenced. Once we decided it was going to be this pseudo 1950s future, the comic book Hard Boiled by Jeff Darrow and Frank Miller definitely became an influence. I think the first game you get is the gun that he has in that comic book. We totally modeled it after it straight up. Same thing with the Blade Runner gun. So we're throwing these science fiction pop culture guns in there alongside like Desert Eagles and stuff. Excuse me.
Everybody was on the same page so much that we rarely said no. There were some things we said no to, but as you can see,
like talking raccoons.
If you had an idea.
I was going to ask
about
that.
Talking raccoons.
Okay.
Sorry, Tim. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. Talking raccoon.
Because there's actually still a reference to the two raccoons that were infected with FEV that happened to escape the Mariposa. No, it wasn't Mariposa. It was the Glow, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And they were never found. And that was something to do with cut content. It was called what? The Slantier? Well, maybe you could tell me a little bit more about what that was supposed to be and ultimately why it was called.
I think it's Racree.
Yeah.
Racree?
Yeah.
Right.
Racree.
And what's weird is, like, that's a perfect example of us needing ideas for things. The whole FEV stuff, it came partially from a book I had read that postulated that if our double helix was quadruple, it would change the nature of that person's biology so that they were immune to any disease that affected your DNA and RNA, i.e. viruses. And then I read about virions, which are tiny little virus particles. And we just wrote all that stuff together. I wrote stuff and then I'd give it to someone like Chris Taylor to rewrite and put into the manual. Or he'd come to me and say, we need holodiscs that are found at the Brotherhood of Steel. And I'm like, well, here's some stuff I remember from the biology classes I had to take in engineering school. Although why they made me take that, I don't know. And I was doing computer science at engineering, and like, you have to do biology too. So we just wrote all this stuff up, and it's a mishmash, and it all went in there. But at some point after FEV was created, and we were talking about how they did it carefully, and they started on like flatworms and worked their way up. At some point before they did it on a chimpanzee, they were doing it on raccoons. And supposedly 2 of them escaped. And that particular designer really thought it fit the Fallout world to have talking, intelligent raccoons that lived in a hollowed out tree that looked a lot like the Keebler elf tree.
Oh, no.
And
I think there's a cartoon called The Raccoons with that same scenario. Do we know where he is? Is he in cartoons now?
I don't know. There were a couple things that went into Fallout that I found out later. The people had lifted wholesale from other things. I'm like, But Leonard can tell you, because this happened with a lot of his ideas. When Leonard told me about the 50s thing, I was like, I don't know about that. When Brian Fargo thought of the name Fallout, I'm like, I don't know about that. When Leonard suggested the ending, which I wanted to be, they throw you a big party with cake and balloons, and Leonard was like, no, they kick you out. I was like, we can't do that. I mean, so there were multiple occasions where I was like, we can't do that. And I got overridden. In fact, a lot of times I didn't like doing that. If people were arguing, I'd say, I'll step in and make a decision, but usually people would work it out. But on the Recree thing, I remember I didn't like it so much that I just went, no, it's gone. We're not going to put it in. We're not going to make a piece of art for it. We're not going to make a tree. It's gone.
If there was ever anything that me, you, and Jason all thought shouldn't go in, then that was the end of discussion, because no one was going to champion it.
Yeah. So that and part of it was, and I think I've said this before, I don't like the whole talking intelligent Deathclaw thing. I do not like that. Deathclaws were supposed to be the ultimate scary, oh my God, there's a Deathclaw, I'm going to die even though I'm in power armor and I have a minigun kind of encounter. So when it becomes something with a monocle going, hello, I've got a British accent, I'm just like...
You're like, what the hell is this?
Well, I understand where that came from. We weren't involved anymore at that point in time, but what we were involved in is we thought it would be hilarious. We're like, wow, you don't need to do anything, because what you'll do is like, you'll put a cloak on it. I don't even remember if this was in there, but if you put a cloak on it, it'll just be a guy in a cloak. Well, and then when it comes time to fight or whatever, the cloak would come off and it's a Deathclaw. And it was just supposed to be kind of ridiculous, but at the same time, it was supposed to be like a Deathclaw you found when it was, maybe even before it was hatched, and then you got hatched, or you found a baby, whatever. So you were supposed to have raised it, or it was supposed to grow over time. But that was it. It was never supposed to talk. It was always supposed to be just almost like this pet that you could sick on people. And there wasn't supposed to be any Deathclaws in the Vault 13 when you got there. It was supposed to be completely empty. So all that stuff was just, when we heard they were doing that, we were kind of a little bit irked, because it's like, that's so close to something that we just said. There was a line. I mean, as you can tell from all the stuff that made it in, we were very liberal about like what kind of craziness we thought was cool, but there were certain things that it was just too far. And after we left, we were obviously not making those calls anymore.
What about the fuzzy mammalian Deathclaws from Tactics?
We don't talk about that game.
We don't know. It was honestly, I just finished a series on it not long ago. It was better than I was expecting going into it, honestly.
It has good art, doesn't it? I thought
it does.
Art and the engine were really nice.
They refined it from Fallout 2, so it looked good compared to Fallout 2. But then you had the fuzzy Deathclaws, which were fun. They were fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Fallout 2, I don't know if it made it in. Did the ghost in the den make it into Fallout 2?
Yes, it did. You find the ghost in the den, and you got to find the old artifact to let her leave the plane or something like that.
Now, here's the thing. That was my idea. Chris Avallone hated that idea. I now agree with them that was a bad idea. And here's why. Fallout has enough stuff in it that you don't really need to add aliens, and you don't really need to add ghosts or talking Deathclaws or whatever. You don't need all that. It's got enough as it is. And if you open up the doors for too many things, if it can be anything, then it's nothing. And I kind of wish I hadn't opened the door to supernatural stuff, just because you don't need it. There's enough there to chew on that adding even more stuff just dilutes it.
Speaking of supernatural, there was a time I was reading that time travel was considered for Fallout 1, but that was ultimately cut. And is that the reason? Because you felt there was too much, and adding another dimension like time travel would just muddy the waters a bit?
It was a lot. It was an earlier idea. And also, I've always been about time travel.
Yeah.
One of the DLCs for the Outer Worlds, they were going to put time travel in, and we're like, that's got to cause a lot of problems. It's just really hard. It's hard to make a good time travel story or game. So why make it that much harder for yourself by introducing an element like that?
Speaking of things that were lifted, that found their way into Fallout, I brought this up before the broadcast a little bit, but I wanted to show it off again. This, of course, is Cat's Paw. Now, the Cat's Paw magazine gets into Fallout 1 in a few places, but we were talking, you guys didn't know where this came from. Do you remember how this got into Fallout?
Don't remember, but I remember it being not a magazine, and now I can see that it's rubber heels, and I vaguely remember that we knew that. I don't remember where the picture came from. Like, I mean, that was like early days of the internet, so there was a bunch of weird stuff out. There was more weird.
That's weird, what these are.
Like off-brand things out there than like normal things actually that you could find on the internet.
Somebody just took out the twin grip non-slip rubber heels from the box art and put it in the Fallout 1. And I found these on eBay. That's exactly, they're old rubber heels for women's shoes with little cat's paws on them. And that's why it's called Cat's Paw. But
in our game, it's a magazine, right?
Magazine.
I loved the art on that and the design and just the aesthetic of it. So when we had that, we didn't know what we wanted to use it for. And we decided we were going to make a couple different magazines.
The aesthetic of that area is great.
Yeah.
You also have to remember that for the most of the development of Fallout, we were entirely unsupervised. I was the closest thing to the adult in the room, and
was that saying something?
No,
because it was because he was so much older than all the rest of us.
Oh, ooh. Wait, Leonard's 2 months older than me. Anyway, it was more like, since I was the producer, it was kind of like if the guys got into arguments or they couldn't decide something, sometimes, I mean, Leonard, you had an argument with Chris Taylor right in my office, or right in the hall right outside my office. And to this day, I don't remember what they were arguing about, but I basically went out there and said, if you guys don't stop arguing and decide on something, I'm going to decide, and it's going to be whatever's easiest for me to code. So you won't like it.
I don't remember what that was.
Yeah. And they were like, one of you, I went back to my office and one of you went, uh-oh, Dad's angry. and the next day, all you'd tell me is, we resolved it. So I didn't even know what you were arguing about, but you worked it out. But the problem with that was I didn't always have the best judgment. So things just slid in sometimes, because if it made me laugh, especially, it usually got approved by me. And they knew that.
It was like we were learning as we made the game. We were learning how to actually build a world and like what would be cool and not. And, like there were some things that we never would have put in there. Like I said, the power armor is something that if we were following our rules, it probably would have looked differently, but it was just something that was from all these influences that we liked, like City Lost Children and different things, that we thought it would be cool to throw something like that in there. So sometimes it leads to cool juxtaposition of different themes or artistic styles. And sometimes it's kind of like you start veering off the course, and it's kind of like what Tim was saying with the ghosts. I mean, the flying saucer and the Elvis painting, it's funny. I mean, I still think it's funny, but at the same time, it's like like Tim said, when you start opening the door up to all that stuff, then it's almost like the game, it's fine for the game to do that. And it was always like those were just Easter eggs, but we had all this space for random encounters. We just thought it would be funny. But not ever having done this before, we didn't realize that was then opening the door to every crazy idea that somebody wanted to put into the game, because we were just kind of fast and loose with those things.
So there are moments in the game where I feel like some restraint was placed down to kind of further hone the feel of the world. Like when you go to the necropolis and you're talking with Set, he's got this conversation about steam trucks and how awful these steam trucks are, and they come in, but this will have been the first time we find a steam powered vehicle in the universe. That we don't really find any wreckages of the steam trucks. So it's like it's mentioned, and then it kind of gets trailed off a bit, and we never get a resolution on that. Is that partly why? Because adding like steam powered vehicles to the universe would overcomplicate it?
There was that. I don't even remember ever like having a conversation about that one. What happened with the Talking Heads was that we had VO recorded for all of them. And we had kind of all agreed very early on of like the general ideas and the general story and the general tone. And then Scott Campbell, who was the original designer, went off and made these basically the Bibles for the different areas that we would use to design them. We were all like, okay, those look cool. And then he left, and Chris Taylor kind of took over as lead designer. And then me and Jason kind of went off and concentrated on the art. And to this day, I have no idea how this happened. But near the time when we were starting to wrap up the art, Jason was doing some testing, and he found the Brotherhood of Steel was virtually empty except for the 2 talking heads that were there, characters that were there, who already had fully recorded video audio. And so he had to go in there and start like writing some stuff up. And he actually had to cut up one of those conversations almost completely and rework it from existing VO, try to figure out how we could make something work that was telling the player what we wanted the player to know at that point. And then a couple weeks later, I had actually gone off on my honeymoon. I come back and Jason's like, hey, remember the Brotherhood of Steel? And I'm like, yeah, thank God we caught that. Well, most of the rest of the game is like that too. I'm like, what? So we had virtually no content in the game, even though we had all these plans for what we were going to do. There was some stuff in there. It wasn't completely empty, but there was a lot of areas that just weren't done. And some of the talking heads, none of them were as bad as the one that Jason had to completely redo in the Brotherhood of Steel. But like the Master, I ended up redoing the Master's conversation, mostly just redoing the player's dialogue so it made sense and you could kind of figure out what was going on and what you're supposed to be doing. But there were places I had to reorganize things a little bit. And that was 100% out of necessity. We just started like piecing the game back together and, writing stuff. Like I'd written when I was a kid, I read a ton, but it was one of those things where it's just like, well, we can do better what's in there than what's in there now. So we just started doing it. And that's kind of, again, totally changed the direction of my career, because up until that point, I've been mostly just an artist. And so I think that's where some of that, if we want to call it disconnect, comes in, because did Scott write those, or did Chris write the original version before Marco Green did the revisions on those? Do you remember, Tim?
Marco Green did the final stuff. I think Scott wrote some of them, and Chris Taylor wrote others, and then Marco Green revised them all, and then they were VO'd and locked.
Yeah, so that a lot of that stuff was done when I guess Chris was reviewing it. I don't think you reviewed it, Tim. I know that I wasn't even looking at that stuff at that time, because I'm like, I have no business looking at that. I'm just the art director. And it wasn't until the design ball was kind of dropped that me and Jason appointed ourselves the masters of tone and feel for the game. And then we started. What's that?
That was like in July or August of '97, wasn't it?
It was fairly late that we started doing that. I can't believe how much we did in that short period of time.
Wow.
A few months before we shipped.
That's insane.
Yeah.
We wrote a lot of stuff in that time. Yeah. We were there 7 days a week at that point.
6 months, we were there every day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did just want to quickly mention, thank you, everyone. We were at $2,066.71 raised, which is just absolutely amazing. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you. That's fantastic.
It's awesome.
I did want to mention, so we got the team coming together here, and a few people that couldn't be with us that I did want to mention. So we talked about Chris Taylor, who came up with a vision statement that started to kind of focus in what Fallout would be. And it's mega levels of violence. You had better give us that mature rating right now. You can shoot everything in this game: people, animals, buildings, and walls. You can make called shots on people, so you can aim for their eyes or their groin. Called shots could be more damage, knock the target unconscious, or have other effects. When people die, they don't just die, they get cut in half. They melt into a pile of goo, explode like blood sausage, or several different ways, depending on the weapon you use. When I use my rocket launcher on some poor defenseless townsperson, he'll know, and his neighbors will be cleaning up the blood for weeks. This is the Wasteland. Life is cheap, and violence is all that there is. We're going to grab the player's guts and remind him of this.
He was a good writer, wasn't he?
Yeah.
That's right to the point.
It's effective.
Anthony Postma, we talked about earlier, the conceptual design, did the iconic cross-section poster from the opening of the game.
Yeah, he drew that for me, and then I painted over the top of it, because I really wasn't good with architecture or stuff like that. I was all about like that woman up front. The guy, he had this really weird look when he drew him, and I'm like, ooh, I'm keeping that. So that pretty much looks like what he did. But I just found it, like, I think it was a 1950s stewardess, as they called them at the time, as opposed to flight attendant, or this really cheery woman that I put in there. That was my forte at the time, was like portraits and stuff like that. So, but yeah, he did some really cool stuff. Like I had no idea how you would do a cross section of the vault, and he drew that up in like a couple of days. That was just a phenomenal thing. And like I said, I go to him with these crazy like asks, like, can you give me this industrial looking interface that looks really like it's part of this world? And then he would just whip something up, and me or Jason would then go in and put it into the interface. So without, he did a lot of that the cool nuts and bolts stuff that we really needed, that kind of somebody who had had that kind of training to do. So, we wouldn't have come up with half of that stuff if we hadn't had him around.
Yeah, anecdotally, an interesting story about him is he left Interplay and went to work for South Park Studios as a storyboard artist, character designer, background and prop designer. And was with them for quite a long time, which is just kind of wild.
Yeah, I hadn't heard about that until years later, that's where he went to.
Yeah.
And then in 2014, I made at Obsidian a South Park game, The Stick of Truth.
Oh, that's right.
So it's funny. I tell people this all the time. No matter who you work with and where you go, it always comes back together. Always.
Yeah, Jason, I'm going to mispronounce this. Is it Suin? Suinn? Swin. The production assistant came up with the anagram for special. Originally, you'd called it Ace Clips.
Ace Lips.
Ace Lips.
And I actually said that to the team. I was like, hey, Chris Taylor put together most of it, and then I wanted to add luck. And I said, hey, and it turns out the first letter of all of our stats forms the great word Ace Lips. So we're going to call it Ace Lips, and we'll probably do some art based on that. And Jason literally came up to me after the meeting and went, I noticed you could form it into another word. And he wrote up on my whiteboard, special. And I went, okay, that's better. That's better. I mean, oh my God, what if he hadn't done that?
Like years later, Bethesda released, it was like a cute little special storybook for kids that they actually produced as a merchandise item. And in my mind's eye, I just see Ace Lips.
Ace Lips.
With a smiling baby on the front.
And it wouldn't have been your special, it would have been what? Ace Lips. I don't even know. I don't even go there.
Wow.
So yeah.
Talking about the writing and artistry, GameSpot had commented in November of '97 that Fallout oozes style, not content, with extrapolating a plausible but unexciting high-tech view of the future. Fallout's design team instead crafted a vision of the future that combines 1950s Cold War American culture and early primitive computer technology, complete with ugly green monochrome screens and an abundance of vacuum tubes with advanced energy weapons and chemical compounds. That pretty much sums it up.
Remember we talked about, like, at the time, before we made Fallout, some Russian jet had been captured and it had vacuum tubes. And apparently it was because that made it EMP proof. And we were like,
that's interesting.
Oh. So yeah, we should have vacuum tubes. And then we watched things like Fantastic Planet. And even though it was supposed to be the future, I mean, all their technology was clunky. And Forbidden Planet.
Yeah, Forbidden Planet.
I vaguely remember that review, because I feel like that was one of the few reviews that I remember that kind of really got it as far as I was concerned. Because I mean, I loved the RPG stuff we put in there. I loved the storytelling and all that. But to me, the main thing from the very beginning was just that I mean, oozing with style, or like, just feeling like you're, steeped in that from every part of it, just feeling like you're in that world. And I think that, to me, that's the thing that we nailed more than almost anything else. I mean, I think I love all aspects of the game. I think we did a lot of great stuff in there, but to me, that was something you didn't see as much in video games, regardless of whether it was fantasy or, something else. It just felt like it was either, an existing IP or straight up generic fantasy. I felt like we really brought something that was kind of different and unique in terms of not only a different setting, but just in terms of how deep we went with it, in terms of like trying to immerse people in it and make them feel like everything about this was bringing them into the world.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's kind of the some of the secret sauce that really impressed people at the time and really is enduring now. At the time that you first started working at this, it was like, okay, great, another dungeon, another medieval fantasy, and then you come out with something that's completely different, stylistically and tone and a whole world. It was really incredible.
I think too, a lot of those games, the players were class-based, their characters. So the game tried to react to your class, where since we were skill-based, it wasn't so much we reacted to skill, we reacted to what you did. And that just was a whole different way of thinking about. We didn't craft an adventure in a dungeon for certain classes to do things that would be their time to shine. We just created problems for the player to figure out their way through.
Did you have a philosophy for Fallout?
We had a way of thinking of parts of the game. Like, I know from very early on, and this was from GURPS, I said, look, every quest you should be able to fight your way, talk your way, or sneak your way through. I wanted the game to be reactive. I mean, the whole reason the end slides were in the game is we were tracking what you did so that dialogues could react. People could react to what you had done. You could get reputation and all that. Since we were tracking all of that, I don't remember when it came up, but one day I just went, we've got all this data we're tracking. We could, when the game ends, we could reflect back to the player. This is what you did. This is what it would lead to. So I think that was some of our philosophy was play how you want, but accept the consequences of what you did. Which is why it was always frustrating when people say, well, I killed people and the game let me do that. No, the game just watched you do that and remembered that you did that.
It's going to remind you that you did that.
Yeah, don't make it the game's fault that you went crazy, because since there was a pacifist playthrough, well, pacifist with quotes, because part of the pacifist playthrough is setting off a couple thermonuclear bombs, but you didn't have to shoot anyone or stab anyone to finish.
Just a couple of nuclear weapons is all.
Just 2 quick bombs.
I think, within reason, obviously, especially with our limited technology, our main goal was, and I always feel like this is harkening back to my early non-experience with Dungeons and Dragons. It's just like we really wanted the player to be able to do anything we wanted. And again, that conversation me and Tim had about those early GURPS games, we wanted players to be able to play the game any way they wanted to. It was about them defining their character and being able to build their own story. And, the dark humor and the tone were other things that we were really focused on a lot. Like even before we had figured, and I think one of the reasons that the 50s thing slid in there so much is like we were already developing this game that felt very much almost like a 50s B movie in a lot of ways in terms of the way we're handling certain things. So I feel like we were almost moving there subconsciously. So maybe that's one of the things that triggered the idea to do that. But it really was that personality that was the personality of the game is a combination of the personalities of the first original people who got together in that room and kind of came up with what it was going to be. I think was Chris Taylor in that original group, and then he didn't work on it until later.
Chris Taylor was involved from almost the beginning like that, but because he was on Stone Keep, I wasn't allowed to actually make any use of him. But he would come to our after-hours meetings. He would suggest a lot of things, but technically he was not on our team.
Well, the only reason I brought that up is because I feel like his personality is definitely in there too. It's so funny. You can almost see what each of us brought to the table a little bit in terms of our personalities.
Well, it's just when I was asked by the VP of development, is Chris working on your game? I'd be like, no, he's totally not working on it. Because he wasn't. He was during his 9 to 5 with Stone Keep. Well, probably like 10 to 7. But he would stay late and he would come by my office and see what we're doing and throw out suggestions, and he'd play GURPS with us. And so he was involved from the beginning. He just couldn't technically be attached to the team until Stone Keep shipped.
War.
95, maybe 96.
Hey, I've got a question. What's the deal with Uncle Slappy? Right? Because Harold is already a peculiar of enough character, right? You meet Harold and he's weird. But to get to Harold, we've got to go through Uncle Slappy, who sits there going, Deathclaw, Deathclaw, do, Deathclaw. Why were there levels of silly added upon levels of silly to get to that point?
I feel that seems like Chris Taylor to me.
Was it?
Yeah, that wasn't that. I don't believe that was me or Tim, because, like I said, I mean the VO and the main quote unquote main characters. A lot of that was done fairly early on. Chris had done a lot of the writing on that stuff, and then of course when we came in and started cleaning everything up and making sure it all kind of fit together, that's when we really kind of started dictating how some of that stuff would be. But a lot of that stuff was already in there. So it's not like we changed direction of the game when me and Jason became the tone hitman, make sure that it's hitting what it's supposed to hit. It was more like we didn't feel like it was what we originally set out to do. It wasn't like this new direction. It was like, no, this was the game we said we were going to make originally. We're just kind of policing us getting to the finish line and actually making that game that we all agreed we were going to make. And again, we let all kinds of crazy ideas happen. So we did open the door for a lot of that stuff. And some of it we might have decided was too silly. Like maybe we would have taken Uncle Slappy out or whatever, and I think some of that stuff, I think it's great that it's in there. I think we
memorable.
Never would have.
Very memorable.
We never would have made that choice. I don't think consciously, or at least I might not have consciously, but it's cool that it's in there,
Harold was in the hub, right? And
yeah,
Slappy was in the room before him.
Right. Well, you have to go kill the Deathclaw as part of the Fargo Traders quest, right?
Okay.
So you got to go talk to Harold, but then Harold doesn't want to take you to the Deathclaw because he's scared of it. So instead, you've got Uncle Slappy outside who's just do Deathclaw, being crazy. He's like, "Oh, I can take you to that Deathclaw," and then he's the one who takes you to the Deathclaw.
Okay.
So
I'm wondering, since Harold was VO'd, I wonder if Uncle Slappy was written to
could
plug
be
a hole in Harold's VO that we couldn't figure out how to.
But what's weird is, since me and Jason were doing all the patch up work on that stuff, that does not sound like something that Jason would have written. So that means that I would have written it. And I feel like if I had written that character, I would remember writing that character. I would love to take credit for it, but I do not remember doing that, because that was the other thing. So we had all this VO recorded and the characters, and a good portion of the talking heads did not give you the information that they were supposed to give you.
Or gave you the wrong information.
Or give you the wrong information. So there was a lot of NPCs who didn't have voices standing next to the talking head NPCs who would say, "That's not quite right. Let me fill you in on what's really going on."
Another favorite of mine is actually in the Boneyard when you're going on the quest to figure out between the regulators and the angels in there about what's going on. You're going through the quest, you're talking all the serious stuff, and then you find Christine, and you talk to Christine, and she goes, "CD itty bitty ducks," and you say, "MR not ducks," and she says, "OSMR, CD itty bitty wings," and you say, "YIB, MR ducks." And that's the conversation.
I'm pretty sure that's Chris Taylor.
That's the entire conversation. Her entire point is just talk about ducks that aren't there.
Chris seems like somebody that would be a lot of fun to hang out with.
There's a lot of stuff in the game that were inside jokes for people who worked on it, like the cow that says "moo," I say. Like, you rarely see it, but there's a Brahmin that they all say "moo," but occasionally one will go "moo," I say.
It's in a random encounter. You see a herd of Brahmin, and one of them will go "moo," I say.
That was because on one of the MUDs I played, somebody had these cows. I think they were called snow cows, and they would go "moo," "moo," I say. And I managed to figure out how to move one of its location, and I put him in the guy's tower. So when he logged into the game, there was a snow cow sitting right there in his workroom going "moo," "moo," I say. And Chris Taylor thought that was the funniest thing in the world. So all of a sudden, we had a Brahmin that could talk. And I'm like, oh, I don't want this to be canon. So I guess it got moved into a random encounter because those were actually hidden behind your luck score. Another thing the game did not make clear was you had to have a progressively higher luck to get some of these more obscure, weird random encounters on the world map. But,
That explains it.
yeah. We were goofy. We were in our 20s and
I know,
no
right?
one was watching us. And
Talking about NPCs, what are do either of you have a favorite Fallout NPC? One that you just really love or you enjoyed creating?
gee.
I like the Master a lot.
Yeah.
I had originally done the art for him, and that was 100% just designed in 3D. I took the Master's chair and just a generic 3D head we had in the engine. I don't think it was even one of the clay heads. I think it was just, I don't remember where I got the basic generic body that we used to make all the characters out of, but I took that head and I just started putting pieces onto it. And then I loved what they did with the VO stuff. And then, of course, at the end, the fact that you could talk them into it. And then I feel like that's really where I started to do a lot of writing. Was I rewrote virtually everything the player character said to try to drive the conversation and to let you know what was going on. And so it was less about the character, more about my personal experience with him. But I still think it's really cool. I mean, people still talk to me about how the fact that they could convince the Master to blow himself up, to basically commit suicide as opposed to fighting him, was such a revelatory thing for them. Which is funny because I thought it was just a really cool thing. I had no idea that wasn't something that other games hadn't done before. All of this stuff, I think that's part of it too. I know Tim knew much more about video games at the time than I did, but I really feel like it was kind of like our attitude the whole time was like, why can't we do this? Why games should do this, right? This is fine. This is what video games are for.
Well, we talked about what happens if you get to the Master and you're not good at combat.
Yeah.
What are you supposed to do? What's your stealth path and what's your dialogue path? And we didn't want to make it trivial. So there are a lot of things you had to do to support those two paths.
It's funny. I mean, I think Tim might have a different opinion about it. But when you work on something, to me, it's about the work we're doing and about what we're trying to accomplish. It's like I see them as characters, but I also see like a lot of the behind the scenes stuff that's going on and what they were supposed to be doing. So it's like when you say what's your favorite character, I start thinking about like, oh, I really loved when I was doing the texture map for this character or the lighting. I loved the fact that we figured out a way. I'm like, Tim, if I don't ever have Gizmo get up from that desk could be part of his sprite, right? And so we had to make a death where he died. He could only die. He wouldn't move. He'd only die from one rotation.
You had to make a called shot wireframe of the desk.
I know. I remember. I did it.
Yeah.
So it's really more about, for me, the little moments and the things we were able to put in that just were really fun for us, as opposed to like looking at it from the outside going like, oh, that was a really cool character. I don't know until Fallout 3 came out and you could get Fallout 1 and 2 for free for a short period of time. And I replayed both of them before playing Fallout 3. I don't know that I had ever played Fallout 1 all the way through after it was finished. I played it through a couple times as we're developing it, and some of those were just aborted because it wasn't finishable in the state it was in. So I played it through probably once or twice completely, but it was always as part of the development. So it's until years later, I generally don't play my games as a game. And I know that Tim played a lot of Fallout at the very end, testing all these different characters and stuff. So did you have a favorite character that really appealed to you?
I mean, and I'll even say I didn't write any of the characters. I didn't do their base writing, nothing to do with the rewriting. And I was going to say it was either Harold or Set because I love the way they talk. They both have very distinctive styles of talking. But then I remembered Tandy and why I like Tandy so much. She's so innocent and sweet. And then she gets kidnapped by the raiders. And when you go and rescue her, you don't ever have to go back to Shady Sands. And you can drag Tandy all over the Wasteland as an extra companion. And I thought that was hilarious because I remember QA actually said, hey, I think it's a bug that you you don't have to take Tandy back. And I'm like, that's not a bug. This whole game is about player agency.
Technically, it was a bug, but we didn't. Well, it's not a bug if it's not a bug if we just didn't implement it correctly, I guess, because it worked. It worked as designed. We just forgot the fact that we just figured everyone would go right back there and
to finish the quest. Go back to Airdash. Okay, your daughter and get your reward.
I might have to amend my opinion to say that Tandy is one of the best characters, only because I loved what we did with her at the end, where we're like, okay, this almost valley girl, innocent, know nothing. Oh, she's the leader, and she's the wise ancient woman, who's now running the NCR. That to me was. I was so happy with it. Yeah.
Speaking of glitches, I was always really curious about companions, in particular, Ian. Like, were they ever tested with SMGs? I only ask because we can't give them SMGs. If they have SMGs, we die.
You could have stopped that question after, were they ever tested?
I have so much to say about companions. Because here's a perfect example of what we were saying earlier about whose idea were them. Everybody basically says Jason Anderson was the one who really championed getting companions in the game. But I have tons of notes. We talked about putting companions in the game in 1994. Jason was on board, or maybe it was early 95. We talked about it and decided it was beyond the scope of the game. We were not going to, it was going to be single player, no companions. We were well into development. It was probably 96 when Jason decided, no, let's try to get companions in the game. And he worked with one of the scripters, Jess Hennig. Sorry, we had two Jessies. So Jesse Hennig was called Jess and Jesse Reynolds got to be Jesse. So Jess Hennig was a scripter and he and Jason worked on figuring out how to script, no code, pure script. And they did it for Dogmeat. So Dogmeat was the first companion because Dogmeat has no dialogue, no inventory, just follows you around, fights what you fight. Everybody loved it. QA loved it. Everybody started talking about it. I wrote the AI for the game. I had no time to write a companion-based AI. I had only written enemy AI. And everyone was like, well, just use that. There's a problem with using that. Enemies don't, when they check to see whether they're going to shoot you, they just have to know you're in range and I have line of sight. I will now take my shot. That was the extent of the AI because this was in the 90s. We were running on 486s. I only had so many precious little cycles and we were trying to do this advanced graphics, high res. So we just kind of tried to get the companions to use the enemy AI. So when Ian shot that SMG that he comes with, designer, I think, didn't you give Ian that SMG?
I made no design decisions of that sort.
He just would go, oh, I see a super mutant. He's in range. I'm going to burst mode him. Because that'll do a lot of damage. He didn't care that you were in between him and the super mutant because there was no test for that. There was no line of sight. There was no, hey, you may want to step 10 feet to one side. There was none of that. And there was no time to put that in. Like we were saying earlier, we're already there. We were there 12 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week for at least the last 6 months. So it was like, okay, you guys thought it was a great idea to put companions in. And now we've put them in and everyone loves them and they can't be removed. But there's a whole lot of bugs. And the bugs we focused on were crash bugs and bugs that made the game unfinishable. So things like Ian shooting everybody in the back, that was low priority. I mean, I wanted to fix it.
But I still think Jason was right. We needed them in the game.
I'm also not going to confirm or deny that maybe it was fixed at a later date. But anyway, yeah, it's basically he's missing code. He doesn't know that you're a friend when he's lining up a shot.
So companions based on enemy AI, is that why the only way to trade with them is to either barter or steal from them?
There was no time to write a UI for let's deck out what he's wearing. So it was reverse pickpocket.
Yeah, that's all you could
friends
sneak up and then reverse pickpocket.
It was the only reason that was possible because we had pickpocket, which could go either direction. We're like, well, we'll use that for your companions, and they'll never get mad at you. I think I did go in there and say, okay, if you're a companion, don't call out the person for pickpocketing you. But that was it. There was just no time for.
But you could exploit it even more. Like if you barter with them in the trade dialogue, you can put anything you want in their inventory and set it at $0, and they think, hey, that's a great trade. But it ignores their carrying capacity. So you can an entire dungeon just bartering with a companion.
It sure does.
Companion of infinite holding.
That's right.
and what to me, the reason this makes me a little aggravated was that code was great for what it was written for. And then it was just bent.
You're like, my masterpiece.
Yes, my perfect
my
diamond,
child.
My perfectly crafted diamond of code. My code was not that nice, but it did its job. And then it was just bent and warped by these scripts that were made for companions and doing things it was never intended to do.
You know, talking about decisions that were made late. So Diablo came out in 96. You were still a year away from launching. That game was just an insane success. I remember I had just got our first PC. It was one of the first games that I got. I remember how big a deal everyone was talking about it. How did the launch of that game get you to think or rethink what you were doing, or maybe make some other considerations?
As a game player, I loved Diablo.
Yeah.
As the producer on Fallout, I hated Diablo. I had so many meetings with Interplay upper management trying to convince me to convert Fallout to real-time combat 2.5 years into its development. And we kept having meetings after meetings after meetings, and I didn't know what to do. And I forget who on the team told me to do this. I want to say it might have been Fred Hatch, my assistant producer. He went, agree to do it. Just go ahead and tell me you agree. And let's work up how many extra man hours and what it will do to our budget schedule. And I was like, that's brilliant.
Genius.
We made a schedule for them. It added, I think, an extra 2 years and like another $1 million. Fallout costs $3 million. It costs about $1 million a year. So it would add another couple million to the budget. And I went, oh, here you go. Let's do it. Let's do it. Here's what it would take. Oh, I need more people too. And they were like, you can't do this. And I'm like, nope, you want this. This is your idea. Let's do it. Let's do it. So I totally turned it around. Instead of being the person pushing against it, I was pulling for it. And then they were like, we'll get back to you. And no one ever mentioned it again.
I've worked in corporate for a long time now, and I may have done that a few times. It's the fastest way to shut down a CEO.
Yeah, I just want to be clear. That was not my idea. I'm not really good at this kind of thinking, this kind of tactical managerial thinking. Whoever told me it, and I'm pretty sure it was Fred, it was brilliant. All I did was do it. I didn't think of it. I just did it, and then it went away. And I went back to coding.
Talking about the music, how big a part did the music play into the setting the tone for the world? What were some of the thoughts you had in picking particularly the opening music and also bring on Mark Morgan from Starship, of all things?
Well, I think those are two different things. Yeah. Leonard had more to do with the cinematic music.
Right.
So you can talk about that. I had more to do with the in-game ambient music. So that was basically, I used to listen, I always had headphones on because I had to code, and Interplay was a very, very, very loud company. So I would just always put on ambient music. And I had stacks of CDs of ambient music. Brian Eno, Aphex Twin.
Aphex Twin, yeah.
I had a 4-volume set called The History of Ambient Music. It was just awesome. And the fourth one was called Isolationism. And I got a lot of stuff off that. So when it was time to make musical tracks for the game, I gave a stack of those CDs and a piece of paper to Charles Deenan, our audio director, and basically said, here are tracks that I love that I would love to have in our game, but we can't really license them. So can you have someone make tracks that sound like they belong on these albums? So make some Aphex Twin sounding stuff. Make some Brian Eno sounding stuff. One of them has a bit of Depeche Mode in, just because I told them I like Depeche Mode. So those are where the ambient tracks came from, and I loved them. Mark Morgan was brilliant. He was one of these like wonderful finds that we did at the last minute. He did great stuff. But as for the ink spots and that music, that was entirely Leonard and a few other artists who did that.
Yeah, when me and Jason started making the intro, I had this vibe in the back of my head that I wanted us to hit. I knew I wanted it to be this weird, melancholy, sad kind of feel, haunting thing. And I couldn't quite put my finger on what I was thinking of. Years later, I realized it was a combination of the end of Dr. Strangelove, when all the nuclear bombs are going off and it's playing Vera Lynn's We'll Meet Again.
Yeah.
And because if I'd known that, if I'd remembered that, I probably would have tried to get a version of that song in there. And the other one was at the beginning of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. There's this really haunting piano thing in there, and I really love the feel of that. It's just like you hear an old movie projector going, which is almost louder than the music at times. And so they both had this really haunting feel to them, but I'm like, all I could think of was like, I don't know, I want something haunting. And so everyone kind of would throw out ideas, and no one really kind of had a vibe for it, or could feel or get the right music that had the right feel for it. And Gary Plattner was one of our artists, brought in I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire by the Ink Spots. And the minute I heard it, I was like, yes, that is exactly what we want. And it also triggered something I couldn't quite remember. It turns out years later, I saw the very original trailer for Blade Runner, and they used that. It wasn't the whole thing. It was like, these trailers seemed to go on forever. I think it was like 2 minutes long or something. That was a small chunk of it, but to me, that was like this really haunting noirish thing. So I thought that was really cool. But the extent of it was like, oh, it's haunting, and he's saying, I don't want to set the world on fire. Ha ha ha, that's funny. This is a post-nuclear game. So we're like, we're going to get that. We have to get that music. Well, we couldn't get that music because the people who own the rights to it wanted too much money for it. So me and Jason went to our audio director and we said, obviously this is way before MP4s or you could search for music on the internet. We're like, we need some music from the 1930s to the 1950s. What do you got? And he had this, like, it wasn't Time Life, but it was kind of like, here's the Time Life collection of like boxes full of CDs, like just, folders with like CD after CD in them. So me and Jason just went through those. I think it took us a couple days to like just literally like put in and just go through every song on those CDs. And it was almost at the very end, I found Maybe. And it started and I'm like, oh, this is just, I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire. And then he started singing. I'm like, this isn't I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire. I'm like, oh, how lucky, one of their songs sounds almost exactly the same. We'll try to use this one. I didn't find out until I went out and bought the best of the Ink Spots because we needed a cut of it that we could use. That literally every song of theirs sounds the same. It starts with that same guitar riff. I mean, they're virtually identical. But what's funny about that is, I heard that. I'm like, that sounds close enough. Let's get it. We were able to get it, put it in the intro. And that was before we had come up with the ending. And then we did the ending and I'm like, if we put that music that we have for the intro, it like bookends the whole thing, but it's like those lyrics were written for being kicked out of the vault because the guy's saying, maybe you're going to ask me to come back someday and maybe I'll say maybe. And I'm just like, because we liked it at the beginning because it sounded very haunting. It was almost like civilization was talking to mankind or something. It's just like, hey, we'll come back later if you want us to. But then at the end, we're just like, it was one of those things. It was just a happy coincidence that seemed like this great plan we had from the beginning. But it really, to me, that song is just, the weight that song carries with it, that feeling that you get from that song is just phenomenal.
And then something I just always like to add to Leonard's story. So we shipped in October of 97. December of 97, I went back east and visited my family, and we went up to see my grandfather. And I brought a videotape, a VHS tape of our opening Fallout movie. And when it started playing that music, my grandfather got this big smile. When it finished, he said, "Thank you so much for putting my favorite group in your game." And I'm like, "What?" And he was like, "Ink Spots. That's my favorite group. When your mother was 5 years old, I took her to an Ink Spots concert in the late 30s. And we stayed out really late. And her mother got really mad at me. But we got to meet the band." And I was like, "What? I didn't know any of this." So
What were you saying there?
yeah. And so This is interesting. So Bethesda bought the rights.
For Fallout.
They invited me to and they made Fallout 3 in 2008. And they had the ship party in LA, and I lived down in Orange County, and they invited me to the ship party. I went into the party, and I could hear the Ink Spots playing, and I thought it was recording. I walk around the corner, and there's a live band playing. And I'm just sitting there. There's hardly anyone watching them. And I just go up front and I'm watching because they look like them. Because now I've seen them a lot. And when they get finished playing and they take a break, I go up and go, "Who are you guys?" And I'm like, "We're the Ink Spots." And I'm like, "You're too young to be the Ink Spots." And he goes, "That was my father. You're thinking of my father." And I said, "Well, I'm the producer from the original game. You're my grandfather's favorite group. And my artists are the reason this song is even connected to the franchise." And we talked for a while about just how random
that is
this all
so
was.
Weird.
Yeah.
The
And
universe has some interesting synchronicity sometimes. Some strings definitely bought.
Yeah.
You know,
Away
talking
home from the
about
party.
Yeah.
I had a cell phone. I called my mom and I said, "I just watched the Ink Spots perform in LA." And she was like, "Oh, I saw them in concert when I was 5." And I'm like, I know. It's just, if you put this in a movie, people would go, "This is stupid." This kind of stuff doesn't happen.
Wow.
But
it's a game that needed to be made, apparently.
all the elements were sitting there in our lives. And we were just the vessels that it flowed through.
You know, bringing up real world music like I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire and Maybe, when you've got those have specific dates when they were published. And so every time I hear a real world song in one of the Fallout games, I wonder about like the divergence, like if it was ever conceived as being a hard line, like the Fallout universe diverged from our universe in 1950 X, or if it was sort of just like a gradient where there are moments of divergence along the timeline until it comes completely divergent. How was that conceptualized?
It wasn't. And now those are the kind of questions that keep things from happening now, because everyone's so into like backstory and that kind of thing. Back then, it was only people like us who were like, "Oh, that'd be really cool." And if I had to justify my rationale for wanting to make it a 50s feature, I had a couple things. The juxtaposition of the fake happiness with this dark world, but it's like I really couldn't have defended it on anything but a gut level. And I think it was Chris Taylor had maybe told you this, Tim, or you were discussing it with him, but you told me that like, oh, the divergence was probably that they never discovered transistors, because and my thing was like, I love giant vacuum tubes because they look so cool, so we're going to throw them on everything. So we never really it was way more about the feel and the tone and the themes that we were playing with than actually going, oh, how did this world diverge from ours? So it was, if I had to go back and figure it out, I think the transistor thing was probably a good place where it split, but I don't think it would have been like one thing. It was kind of like they diverged and were kind of like somewhat similar in development for a while, and they just kept getting further and further away.
Yeah, I think
we used to talk about it.
You see that with a lot of games now where the process almost begins with writing like this world history. So everyone kind of knows what the rules are. Whereas you guys were just like, this is really cool. I'm just going to do this. And who cares why?
Yeah, like I always thought the buildings looked really cool with the faces and that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily fit with our 50s vibe. But that's the Fallout world. And the Fallout world isn't some kind of like, oh, it's our world, but this. It was lots of little things where it diverged from our history, but we were consistent in that divergence. So you felt like you were experiencing a full-on realized world, but it wasn't a clear fork off from our world.
One of the things we found out, and I think this is some things you lose when you plan it out too meticulously from the beginning, is that we would put in things like those heads, or I can't even think of anything off the top of my head, but there was things like, I guess this isn't quite a stylistic thing, but it's a perfect example of this, where like we would put in things because they felt good, or we liked, the vibe of them, or what, for whatever it was. And then later we're like, oh, that's what this means. So it was almost like you're kind of like following, your subconscious, or like you're, going with the flow of the ideas. And then you kind of realize later what you could do with it. The ink spots thing was a complete random thing, but one thing that wasn't was the getting kicked out of the vault at the end. Me and Jace, I was supposed to like render the cake and the balloons or whatever the hell we were going to have at the end. And I'm like, I don't know, how am I going to do that and make it look interesting? And me and Jason were talking. And as we were talking about like what else could happen, I don't remember which one of us suggested it first, but we both came to the conclusion very quickly that like, and this is from everything that was already in the game, it's just like, or at least what was supposed to be in the game, they wouldn't let you back into the vault. That wasn't something we planned, but we just looked at who they were and how they developed their society and who we were saying they were as people. It was very obvious they were never letting you back in the vault, but that was never the plan. It was like, that was because of how we developed them, just kind of like on a gut level, on a lot of the details, or a lot of the different things we put in there. They ended up being that kind of group. And then that led to us kicking you out at the end, which I feel is like, to me, the reason I really loved that was, besides the fact that it felt a lot like the Road Warrior, which was still a major touchstone for us, where he's, it becomes this religious myth at the end. It just had this haunting feeling where it like kind of almost recontextualized everything you went through in the game. Like, because you thought you were being this hero for the vault the whole game, and then at the end they turned their back on you. And to me, it like colored everything that you had done, which I don't know if I could ever plan out something that would be that effective as an ending.
It was, yeah. When you think about it too, it almost parallels our journey in life, where you step out the door, you get on that road, you can go on a journey, but you can't ever go back again. You can't go home.
One thing that reminded me, I was going to say, when Leonard was talking about redoing the power armor, the whole reason we had that power armor is it turned out when we were designing some of the system side, we didn't have armor past that metal armor that with the spikes or whatever. We needed a heavier armor than that to go up against some of the creatures and high-level weapons that we were putting in later. So Leonard made that power armor, but then later when he needed to make a high-resolution version, that's when he changed what it looked. The same thing happened with the Deathclaw. There was no plan for the Deathclaw. That was not something we originally had. We needed to put a big bad monster in. We had no time to make a model, and the D&D group had just made the Tarrasque model and then had cut it from their game. So we got the Tarrasque, that clay model, right? And did you also get the 3D model?
What's that?
Did you get the 3D model too, or did you get the clay model and have to?
Well, it was already digitized.
Yeah.
We didn't have. I think if we would have just had Scott digitize it by hand. So
yeah. So
either or.
Deathclaw came from another D&D team in our company, had a model they weren't using. And we're like, okay, that's in our game. This is a Deathclaw. Boom. It was not planned. Now it's iconic for the game.
Oh yeah.
Like the power armor is. But those things, I'm worried about some modern game development where some publishers won't fund something unless everything gets signed up front and you can hand them a design document. I've been through that. Fallout would never have been made. It just wouldn't have happened. And
almost canceled twice.
Yep. And I'm just sad because I wonder sometimes how many really awesome games haven't been made because they couldn't be rigidly defined in advance in exquisite detail.
I think I'd say I think obviously we set out to make a game where you could play it as many different ways as we could let you. and the fact that we weren't going to make you be good, and we were going to leave it totally up to you, and we had the great morality system and all that stuff. That was all planned, but a good many things in the game, the power armor, the 50s, the Vault Boy, all of that stuff came out of necessity. The power armor, when I went to go redo it for a high res version, I fell so in love with it as I was making it. I kept making it more and more high res that it would stand up to be, this huge picture. When it was a 640/480 on this tiny screen on a screen, we didn't need it to be that high res for that. And we're going to have noise on it. It was going to be black and white, but I rendered this full high res version of it because I thought it looked so cool. And then, the people who are trying to make a box cover for us kind of dropped the ball, and we're just like, we'll make it. And then we took, I think Jason took the background from the movie and did some stuff to it or touched it up. And then, because he had made that background for, when you pull out and you see the ruined city, I think that's the same one. I'm not quite sure. But he put that background behind it. And then we designed the whole box ourselves and what it was supposed to be. But we wouldn't have been able to do that if we didn't have that thing, which has now become iconic for the series. And, it just turns out like, oh, we let you play a man or a woman. So what are we going to put on the cover? Oh, we'll just throw this on there. We didn't even think it that way. It was like, oh, we have this image. Let's use it for the cover because it looks cool. But now all of a sudden it can represent anybody in the game. Maybe it's the Brotherhood of Steel. Maybe it's the player when they get that. It doesn't matter if they're male or female. They're going to look like that when they put it on. And then the reason the Vault Boy existed was only because we had so many different things that you could do in GURPS. This was back when it was still GURPS, that I was art directing the icons. So I was the one saying yes or no and giving feedback on how they should be developed, and I would look at all the icons and I'm like, I can't tell what any of these are. And if I can't tell what any of these are, how is anybody else going to be able to tell these things? So that, and then I came up with the idea we need some kind of mascot like Uncle Pennybags from Monopoly, and again, that was just a reflection of our humor. It was going to be this dark, really dark, humorous thing. But, that wasn't something that we came up with at the beginning of the game or oh, this is going to become emblematic of the whole game. It was it was solving a problem that we had.
Yeah, and I mean, the Vault Boy is now iconic, one of the most recognized mascots in gaming. Yeah.
I hope people aren't disappointed that some of these tent poles of the game weren't these well thought out, pre-planned things. I mean, they were well crafted by incredibly resourceful people. They just weren't things that were we went into the game knowing that this was going to be something we have to make.
I don't think it'll disappoint anyone. If anything, it's going to make it much more interesting.
Makes it way cooler.
It's amazing that so much of the depth came from choices that were kind of forced, like the whole making sure that you could beat the game with a character who isn't, spec'd into weapons, that you can talk your way out of it. That made the Master way more of a compelling character than if he had otherwise just been the big bad monster, which up until the end of the game, everyone who talks about the Master just, talks with the exception of Harold, who actually talks a little bit about Richard Gray. When you hear about the Master, you just think of him as this giant monster. But it's only when he realizes that the presumption underlying all of his decisions was wrong that he becomes more human, because he begins to have regret and realize what he's done. That makes him more interesting. And we wouldn't have had that without a way to talk your way through it. And the same with Overseer Jacorian. If at the very end of the game, if he throws you this big birthday party and all of that, he's less interesting of a character, but he's exhibiting all of his own fears of the Wasteland. I think there was a part where you talk with Jacorian and he's like, oh yeah, the Wasteland isn't for managers like me. What am I going to do in the Wasteland? And he kicks the Vault Dweller back out because he's solely worried about himself. If the Vault Dweller comes into the vault and starts telling all of these stories about all of these adventures, and then all of the young people in the vault get excited and want to go out, he's got no job prospects, right? So it was a very personal and selfish decision that he made to kick the Vault Dweller out, which ultimately led to his own downfall later on when people started to worship him. But I mean, there's all that depth there, right? Which otherwise would have been gone.
Yeah. I was there, and it amazed me to watch this unfold. There were just so many good people on this team that when a problem like this popped up, they just didn't go, oh, well, we have a problem. Oh, well, what should we do? They're like, I think I can do something. Let me go do something. And I think I can fix this. And that happened so many times.
You know, we're running out of time here. So I did want to end with us talking a little bit about the reception and legacy. Role play game of the year from GameSpot, Computer Games Magazine, Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, nominated for the Spotlight Awards. It is listed as one of the greatest video games of all time, which is no small achievement. Fallout has been credited for renewing consumer interest in the role-playing video genre due to its setting, open world plot, and gameplay. It was a commercial success, selling over 500,000 copies, 600,000 worldwide, and people are still playing it to this very day. Here we are 25 years later, you're still making games. Did you ever think it would get this big? Or once you realized, when did it hit you like this is going to be huge?
It was really slow. It took a very long time. I mean, like I said, it was almost a, it was a cult classic. We have, I think, a knack for making cult classics. As I once said, it was like if we knew what we were doing, we'd be making million-selling games as opposed to cult classics. But it had been growing for a while, and then Bethesda, made Fallout 3. But for me, one of the coolest things was when the Smithsonian had that video game exhibit, and we were put in there. And I'd never been to Washington, D.C., and I went to Washington, D.C. and actually saw that exhibit. And to me, that's crazy, because the weird thing for me, and Tim might feel differently about this, but when you kind of grow up with an industry, and when you started in the industry, it was kind of like unofficial, and it wasn't quote unquote a real thing. Like I had advisors from my school, my art center, consoling me, like when I went to go work in the video game industry. Oh, don't worry about it. You're going to just keep with it. You'll get a real art job one of these days. It was really just like this kind of swept under the rug kind of thing that no one really considered as a real thing at the time, even though it was really already starting to make a lot of money for a lot of people. But when you're part of something that grows like that, at least for me, it's almost like it's unofficial. It's almost like it's almost like it's being made up as it goes. Like not just Fallout, the whole industry. Oh, like this company that didn't exist, 5 years ago is now making an award, which, if you think about it, that's kind of what happened with the Oscars, but now it's been around 100 plus years. I think it was the 20s when it started. And now it's this huge thing. But at the time I'm sure some people were like, what is this? So it's like, I think it's when you start seeing recognition from things that were around when we were kids, that were important when we were kids, that it starts to kind of sink in, because everything else seems to kind of be like growing with us, if that makes sense. I don't know, Tim, does it feel different to you?
Well, I mean, I was going to say after Fallout shipped, we were actually going to go do something else. We wanted to work on something else because we worked on it for 3 years, and we're like, I want to work on something else. And another group was taking over Fallout 2. And I think a couple things, Fallout, we got a lot of awards and a lot of press, but then Fallout 2 got a magazine cover. I think PC Gamer magazine cover it. And that rarely happened. I mean, back then there was really no web. So getting a magazine cover was a huge deal. And I remember going, wow, they put Fallout 2 on the cover. And that made me go, it's turning into something. But then what hit me was I was in the PhD program at UCI when I left in 91 to go work at Interplay. And my thesis advisor screamed at me, you're wasting your life. You've got a bachelor's and master's in computer science. You could have a PhD in a few more years. You are throwing it all away. That was in 91. In 98, he called me up and asked if I'd come teach a class at UCI.
That is amazing.
And I did in 99.
Oh, nice.
And I went to lunch with him, and I'm like, you may now apologize to me. And he was like, and he knew I was kidding, but he was just like, I know what I said. But he goes, look what's happened in the industry. And let me tell you something. The industry between 91 and 97 or 98 got a lot bigger. It's huge now. It's bigger than
Yeah.
movies. It's huge. His daughter, about 5 years later, had me come talk at her junior high school about game design. So I feel like I've proved to him that I didn't throw it all away and waste my time. But in my mind, things keep just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I'm glad Fallout got to get bigger along with it. And like Leonard said, Bethesda had a lot to do with that. Fallout 1 and 2 were good, but Fallout 3 kind of mainstreamed the whole thing. And it's amazing. It's got its life of its own now. I mean, Fallout is its own thing now. It's any one person claims that thing. It's just this big, and it means a lot to a lot of people. It has meaning that we may not have put in there deliberately, but it's resonating with so many people. That just makes me super happy that it's out there for people to have.
Yeah, really all over the world. I talked before to another developer, and one of the things we were talking about is it's interesting to see an industry life cycle go in business. How all industries kind of go through this cycle, and then everything starts over again. You have newer engines now like Unreal, where if you want to make a game, you have like a really easy toolbox to do that. So indie game studios and indie games, anybody can kind of go create their game and launch it out now in an accessible way. So it's almost like there's this renaissance of the energy where you want to make a game you want to make. You can actually go do that and actually launch it and get it out there accessibly. So it's interesting to see the industry kind of come back a little bit and see these new and up and coming developers and new games with different ideas.
And I love that. You see indies taking a lot more risk and being a lot more innovative. The only thing that concerns me is so many games are being made right now that the signal to noise ratio is so small. It's hard to get discovered.
Yeah.
It's hard to find those good games because there's just so much out there. They need to be discoverable. But I'm not sure how to fix that.
What about the fans? Over time, you were talking about how it's meant so much to people. Do either of you have a memory that stands out, an interaction that you had with a fan where, it's you kind of step back a little bit and you're kind of taken aback by how much it's impacted people?
I have one. I think I was talking about it earlier. I went to go talk at a game conference in 2016. And after I was on a round table, I went out into the hallway and there was somebody who came up to me with a friend of theirs and they were just crying. They were just crying and crying and crying. And I went to go walk away. I'm like, oh, something's wrong. And they just kind of touched me like that and then just kept crying. And their friend was like, they want to talk to you, but you have to give them a few minutes. And so we just sat there and I just sat with them and they finally started to talk and they said how they had been bullied in elementary school and junior high school. And when they first got to high school, a bully came up to them and they thought, here it happens again. And he wanted to know, he said, hey, I hear you play Fallout. What kind of character do you make? He said, I'm having trouble getting a good starting character. And that was their first friend that they bonded with. And they bonded over Fallout. And when they found out I was speaking, they were like, this was like 15 years later. They're like, I have to go. Because I was in Sydney and they're like, they're in my hometown. I'm going to see this guy. And they told me all this about how their life turned around from that moment. And I was like, I mean, you don't know what to say. It's like, I made something like that touched someone fundamentally, got them through high school. They became an artist. And that's what they're a graphic designer now. And I'm like, wow. It's amazing to hear something like that. And it made me go, I really should go to conferences more because I never really did much, but that memory stands out more than so many other things that happened in my career.
Wow.
What about you, Leonard?
I haven't had anything quite that impactful. A couple things, I worked at Blizzard for a while. So I was doing BlizzCons and it started slowly, and it was funny. It's like almost like as Bethesda started making it, or sometime around then, like all of a sudden, like reporters, when they were asking me questions, would start off telling me how big of fans they were of all the other stuff I had done, especially Fallout. And I'm like, we're here to talk about like the biggest games in the world, and you want to take some of your time to tell me how my game affected you, and that's why you're doing, what you're doing, and it's true. It's like it's almost overwhelming. You don't know what to say when people tell you how much you've affected their lives or changed what they're doing in their lives. This group from Russia actually gave me these nesting dolls that they hand painted that had characters from every one of my games on them, including one that the demo we did, Tim, for the at the end of Troika, we were trying to get a deal. So that was just like, these, and they brought it from Russia. So they brought it all the way to Anaheim from Russia to give me this thing. And then I have a website with my portfolio up there, and you can contact me through there. And I get emails from people once or twice a month. Sometimes they're just asking me questions about the game or, how to get into the industry, which I have no advice on that. So I'm like, well, go to art school and then see what happens. But every once in a while, and I'll always forward these to Tim and Jason, you have somebody just really pour out their heart to you about how much the games, not only Fallout, but our other games as well. So feel very fortunate for that too. How much they meant to people, and the tough times that they kind of got through by playing, whether it's Fallout or one of our other games. And we just wanted to make something that was fun and cool and had a really good feel to it. And the fact that it resonated with so many people is really it is kind of overwhelming.
It's amazing seeing new games being made that they even say we loved Fallout. Atom RPG, obviously influenced by Fallout. The new Broken Roads, it's not out yet, by Drop Bear Bites down in Australia. Yeah, they like Fallout, and I love that because I get to play this game now. I get to enjoy it. I get to be on the other side.
With the Ox, what about you? So rarely do we get a chance to tell people how we fell in love with Fallout.
Well, I mean, I have to say that I'm one of those people who was introduced to the Fallout series through Fallout 3. Fallout 3 came out while I was working in California for a gaming startup company. And I had a lot of friends who were working with me who were so excited about it because they kept on saying, I was a huge fan of Fallout 1 and I'm a huge fan of Fallout 2 and this is going to be amazing and I can't wait. And that was my introduction to the Fallout universe because I hadn't played very many single-player RPGs up until that point. And so I got to play Fallout 3, and the feel of the desolation and the combination of that with the music, which was just so atmospheric, made me fall in love with the franchise. And I stepped away for a while to work on my career at the time, and then I came back with Fallout 4 and got right back into it and went through everything. Fallout 1, Fallout 2, Tactics, New Vegas, just became overwhelmed and obsessed. And I figured, I better find a way to make a living off this if I like it so well. And that's why I started doing this.
Brotherhood of Steel?
No.
The words right out of my mouth, Tim. I really wanted to hear that.
And it's because I don't have a PlayStation 2 at the moment. And that's really the only reason. If I had one, well, then, I'd be playing it.
I don't think it's canon.
It's not. It's not. I think Tactics is semi-canon and Brotherhood of Steel is just, no.
I think we're out of time. Before anyone goes, one thing I did want to mention here in closing. So this is the start of a fundraising season for St. Jude. Thanks to everyone who donated. We're now at $2,186.71 on day number 1. And we'll be running all the way through the end of December with all kinds of programming and panels celebrating all of the games between now and then. One thing I did want to mention as well, in Good Springs, Nevada, Boston, Massachusetts, Washington, D.C., and Sutton, West Virginia, we are throwing 4 in-person Fallout 25th anniversary birthday parties with Bethesda's blessing. So if you can make it out October 22nd and 23rd, Bombs Drop weekend, there's some poetry there. We'll be meeting in those, marching in cosplay, celebrating the games, and raising some awareness for St. Jude. So if you can make it out, if you go to falloutforhope.com, you'll find the link for the 25th anniversary, and you can RSVP and join us at any of those. The spots are limited. So if you can make it down to any of these locations, please do. And yeah, just from me personally and all 150 some odd people here that have been watching with us today all the way through, I get to say something that I'm sure they all would love to say to you. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for creating what you did, and really just the impact that it has had on obviously a significant amount of people, including developers who are making games now. The impact of hanging out, eating pizza, Tim deciding I need to occupy my time with something or I'm going to lose my mind, ended up being one of the most influential games of all time. So thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I hope that origin story proves inspirational to future generations of game developers.
Thank you both for joining us tonight. Thank you so much, Ox, for joining me for this. And please stay tuned. We're going to raid into another fellow team member, the Premier, who is currently streaming. Stick around if you can, or at the very least, keep a tab open. It helps with viewers. He's also raising for Fallout for Hope. We are going to raid. Come on, raid. Thank you all, and good night, everyone. Stay tuned, and we'll have more programming coming for you this month. Maybe.